What happens when a woman who was erased from her own life decides to rewrite her story? This is the vengeance of Eleanor, a phoenix reborn. The clink of ice in Julian Foster's whiskey glass was the only punctuation in the suffocating silence of his penthouse on the exclusive Upper East Side. It was a sound Eleanor Miller had come to associate with humiliation. It was the sound of another Tuesday night. Another evening where her husband, a man whose name was synonymous with technological fortune and ruthless ambition, treated her like a piece of furniture he'd forgotten he owned. Eleanor was sitting across from him on a cream-colored sofa that had cost more than her parents' first car. She was reading a book, or pretending to. The words swam on the page, meaningless black scribbles on a white background. Her focus was entirely on him, on the tense line of his jaw as he scrolled through his phone, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. She knew who he was texting. Celeste Vance. The name was a bitter poison on her tongue, even when unspoken. Celeste was everything Eleanor was not. She was vibrant, with a laugh that demanded attention and a body sculpted by expensive trainers and a strict diet. She was an image consultant, a vague and glamorous title that seemed to imply attending endless parties and being photographed on Julian's arm. Their affair was no secret. It was a public spectacle. Julian had paraded Celeste at charity galas, product launches, and even a family Christmas dinner where Eleanor's own mother had to pretend not to see the possessive hand Celeste placed on Julian's back. "Did you need something?" Julian's voice cut through the silence. He hadn't looked up from his phone. Eleanor's heart gave its familiar, painful throb. It was the question of a man annoyed by a persistent fly. She lowered her book. "I was just wondering if you'd given any more thought to the Children's Hospital fundraiser, the one I'm helping to organize. We need to finalize the corporate sponsorship list by Friday." He finally looked up, and the expression in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated boredom. It was a look that said, "You and your little hobbies. Send the list to my assistant, Marie. She'll handle it." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, his attention already back on the glowing screen. The faint smile returned. A new text from Celeste, no doubt. Eleanor felt a familiar wave of coldness wash over her. It wasn't anger anymore. The anger had burned out long ago, leaving only the gray ash of resignation. She had been Eleanor Miller, an art history graduate with bright eyes and a passion for restoration. When she met Julian, he had been charming, a whirlwind of confidence and power that had swept her off her feet. He had loved her quiet nature, he'd said it was a balm to his chaotic life. 10 years of marriage had revealed the truth. He didn't love her quiet nature, he loved her silence. He loved that she didn't challenge him, that she managed their home with quiet efficiency, that she was a presentable but unremarkable backdrop for his dazzling life. She had faded slowly, until she felt like a watercolor left out in the rain. Her clothes were tasteful but bland, chosen not to draw attention. Her hair was always pulled back in a neat, simple bun. She hadn't bought a new tube of lipstick in 3 years. What was the point? The only person she wanted to see her didn't even look. The real turning point had come 6 months earlier. It was their 10th anniversary. Eleanor had spent weeks planning a surprise. She had booked a private chef, filled the apartment with his favorite flowers, peonies, and wore the blue dress he'd once said made her eyes look like the ocean. He came home late, smelling of expensive perfume. Celeste's signature scent, a cloying gardenia that made Eleanor's stomach churn. He didn't notice the flowers, the chef, or the dress. He walked straight into the bedroom, pulling off his tie. "Long day," he had grunted, not as an apology, but as a statement of fact. "I'm exhausted. I think I'll have an early night." "Julian," she had whispered, her voice trembling, "it's our anniversary." He stopped, his back to her. She saw his shoulders rise and fall in a sigh of pure exasperation. "Eleanor, for God's sake, it's just a day. We've been married for 10 years. What's the big deal?" He had turned then, and his eyes, cold and hard, finally met hers. "Don't be so needy. It's unseemly." The word hit her like a physical blow. Needy. She who asked for nothing. She who swallowed his blatant infidelity with a painful smile. She who ran his life from the shadows so he could shine in the spotlight. That night, something inside her fractured. The hope she had clung to, the foolish belief that the old Julian was still in there somewhere, it finally died. Now, watching him text his lover in the home she had so meticulously cared for, the fracture became a clean break. She stood up. The movement was so sudden that it startled him. He looked up, a flash of irritation in his eyes. "I'm going to my sister's for a few days," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. The decision, once made, felt less like a leap and more like a simple step onto solid ground. Julian shrugged, his thumb already scrolling. "Fine. The sheets in the guest room are clean." He assumed, as he always did, that her life, her plans, her entire existence revolved around his. He didn't ask why. He didn't care. Eleanor walked into their cavernous bedroom. The closet was the size of a small boutique. On one side hung Julian's custom suits and designer shirts. On the other, her own wardrobe of beige, gray, and navy. She packed a small suitcase, not with the muted colors of her current life, but with the few remnants of the woman she used to be. A pair of worn-out jeans, a soft, paint-stained t-shirt, her old art supplies. She took her passport, her personal bank card with the meager savings she'd put away from the household budget, and the small, tarnished silver locket her grandmother had given her. As she passed through the living room, Julian was still on the sofa, bathed in the blue light of his phone. He didn't look up. He didn't say goodbye. She closed the heavy oak door of the penthouse behind her, the soft click echoing the final, silent closing of a chapter of her life. The doorman, a kind man named Jorge, tipped his cap. "Have a good night, Mrs. Foster." "You, too, Jorge," she said, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in months. Outside, the city air was cool and crisp. Eleanor didn't go to her sister's. She walked to the nearest ATM, withdrew all her savings, and hailed a cab. "Penn Station, please," she said, her voice clear and strong. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, she took one last look at the gleaming tower where she had lost herself. Julian wouldn't even notice she was gone. Not really. Not until his shirts weren't perfectly pressed or he ran out of his favorite brand of coffee. And by then, she would be gone. She was no longer Mrs. Foster. She was just Eleanor. And for the first time in a decade, that felt like enough. The ghost was leaving the building, and she wasn't looking back. But how long would it take for the king in his castle to notice a ghost was gone? Would his ego blind him completely? The first year was the hardest. Eleanor didn't fade into a glamorous new life overnight. She fled to a place Julian would never think to look for her, a small, unassuming town in the heart of New England. A place of brick homes and forgotten workshops. It was the town her grandmother had grown up in, a place Eleanor had only visited once as a child, but whose memory of honest, hard-working people felt like a safe harbor. She rented a tiny apartment on the third floor with no elevator that smelled of dust and old wood. For the first few weeks, she did little more than sleep. The exhaustion of a decade of silent suffering was a physical weight, and she gave into it. There were no schedules to keep, no dinners to plan, no passive-aggressive comments to deflect. The silence, which had once been her prison, was now her sanctuary. Her savings, which had felt substantial when she withdrew them, dwindled at an alarming rate. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. She was 34 years old with a 10-year gap in her resume and a degree that felt utterly useless in this new, pragmatic world. One rainy afternoon, looking in the warped bathroom mirror, she finally faced the woman she had become. Her face was pale and puffy, her eyes dull, her hair limp and lifeless. She was the embodiment of neglect. That was the day the chrysalis began to form. It didn't start with a makeover. It started with a decision. She would not let Julian Foster be the author of the final chapter of her life. Her first step was small. She found a job as a waitress at a local diner, a bustling place called the Corner Grill. The work was grueling. Her feet ached. Her hands were raw from hot plates and harsh detergents. And the pay barely covered rent and food. But for the first time in years, she felt useful. People looked at her. They really saw her. They smiled. They said, "Thank you." They told her to have a nice day. She was no longer invisible. She was Eleanor, the quiet waitress who always remembered who took their coffee black. The physical labor began to change her. The puffiness in her face receded, replaced by the definition of her cheekbones. The constant movement toned her body in a way no expensive, unused gym membership ever had. She started walking everywhere, exploring her new town on foot, feeling the strength return to her legs. With her first few paychecks, she didn't buy designer clothes. She bought art supplies, canvases, oil paints, brushes. In the evenings after her shifts, she would climb the 3 flights of stairs to her tiny apartment, put on music, and paint. At first, her canvases were filled with dark, tumultuous swirls of gray and black. It was the pain, the anger, the humiliation. It was all spilling out of her and onto the canvas. It was a messy, painful, but necessary exorcism. Slowly, color began to seep back in. She started painting the town she was discovering. The intricate rust patterns on an old fire escape. The vibrant graffiti on a forgotten brick wall. The way the morning light hit the stained glass of an abandoned church. She was rediscovering her passion, the very thing Julian had once dismissed as a cute hobby. A quiet regular at the diner, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson who owned a small furniture shop, noticed her paint-stained fingers. He asked to see her work. Hesitantly, Eleanor invited him to her apartment one afternoon. He stood for a long time in her tiny living room, which was now more studio than home, his gaze moving from canvas to canvas. "My dear," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You do not see rust and decay. You see stories. You see beauty." The following week, Mr. Henderson cleared his shop window and displayed 3 of Eleanor's paintings. He placed a simple handwritten card beside them, "Local Scenes by Eleanor M." 2 of them sold in 3 days. The money was more than she made in 2 weeks at the diner. But it was the validation that truly mattered. Someone saw value in her vision. This small success was the catalyst. Eleanor, now a working artist, enrolled in a business course at the local community college. She learned about marketing, about pricing, about how to build a brand. She started an Instagram account, posting high-quality photos of her work. She began visiting local art fairs, not as a visitor, but as a vendor. Her style was unique. It combined her classical art history training with the raw, industrial aesthetic of her surroundings. She developed a technique of incorporating found objects, pieces of metal, old gears, fragments of broken iridescent glass into her paintings, giving them a rich, textured, three-dimensional quality. Her work was a conversation between the past and the present, between decay and rebirth. It was the story of her own transformation, told in oil and rust. As her art business grew, so did her confidence. She cut her hair into a sleek, purposeful bob that framed her face. She started dressing in a way that reflected her artistic sensibilities: bold colors, interesting textures, and unique handmade jewelry. She learned to love her own company, but also built a new community. She made friends with other artists, with the gruff but kind diner owner, with the quiet librarian who recommended books to her. She also began therapy. Unpacking a decade of emotional abuse was painful. She cried for the woman she had been, for the years she had lost. But her therapist helped her understand that her softness was not a weakness and that her desire for a loving relationship was not neediness. She learned to set boundaries, to value her own opinion, and to say no. By the end of the 5th year, the woman who had fled Julian Foster's penthouse had vanished. In her place was Eleanor Miller, an artist who was beginning to make waves on the national art scene. She now owned her own gallery, a beautiful space in a renovated downtown warehouse. Her work was sought after by collectors and corporate clients. She was financially independent, emotionally resilient, and radiantly self-assured. What do you think was the most important thing Eleanor learned during these 5 years of transformation? Was it financial independence, emotional healing, or the rediscovery of her passion? One morning, she was at her gallery overseeing the installation of a new exhibition when her assistant, a young, enthusiastic art student named Ben, handed her a glossy magazine. "You are not going to believe this," he said, his eyes wide. Page 72. Eleanor took the magazine. It was a high society publication, the kind she used to find on the coffee table in her old life. And there on page 72 was a 2-page spread about the upcoming Starlight Gala, the biggest charity event of the year back in her old city. The event chair was listed as Julian Foster. And on his arm in the accompanying photo, smiling brightly, was Celeste Vance, now listed as Celeste Foster. They had married. A younger Eleanor would have felt a pang of pain, a bitter twist of jealousy. But looking at the photo now, she felt nothing. A strange, clinical detachment. They looked like two strangers in a photograph, frozen in a world that had nothing to do with her anymore. Ben pointed to the list of major sponsors. "Look," he said, his finger tapping the page. "The Foster Foundation is the title sponsor, of course, but look at the corporate art partner." Eleanor's eyes followed his finger, and there, in elegant script, was the name of the company commissioned to provide the central art installation for the gala. Miller Studios. Her studio. The Starlight Gala, the pinnacle of the world she had fled. And they wanted here, or rather, her work as their centerpiece. The irony was so rich, so potent, it was almost comical. Ben was looking at her, waiting for a reaction. He didn't know her history. To him, this was just a massive professional opportunity. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. It was a real, confident, genuine smile. The chrysalis hadn't just broken. It had shattered, revealing something stronger and more beautiful than she ever could have imagined. "Ben," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Call them. Tell them we accept. And book me a ticket. It's time for me to pay a visit." The ballroom of the Ritz Hotel was a galaxy of manufactured stars. Crystals dripped from chandeliers like frozen rain, casting fragmented light over a sea of couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos. The air buzzed with the rarefied murmur of old and new money, a symphony of champagne glasses, discreet laughter, and the ceaseless networking of the city's elite. This was the Starlight Gala, Julian Foster's annual monument to his own philanthropy and power. At the center of the room, roped off by velvet cords, stood the night's central art piece. It was a sculpture, but that word felt too small, too static. It was an installation, a living work of art titled Echoes of a Renaissance. 3 enormous translucent panels, each over 10 feet tall, were arranged in a soft curve. Embedded in the polished resin were the ghosts of industrial decay, rusted gears that seemed to float in the air, delicate filigrees of verdigris copper, and fragments of shattered iridescent glass. Yet woven through this metallic skeleton were streaks of pure, brilliant color swaths of sapphire blue, emerald green, and a defiant, burning crimson. Hidden lights pulsed from within, causing the colors to shift and glow, making the rusted metal seem to breathe. It was breathtaking, a powerful statement about the beauty that could be forged from ruin. The artist, according to the program, was a rising star named Eleanor Miller, a name that meant nothing to Julian Foster. He had barely glanced at the proposal, delegating the artsy stuff to the event committee. His focus was on the real prize, the multi-million-dollar donations they would extract from the city's wealthiest patrons before the night was over. He stood near the entrance, a king surveying his court. By his side, Celeste Foster glittered in a silver gown that clung to her like a second skin. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an intricate updo that must have taken hours. And the diamond collar at her throat, Julian's latest, "I love you," was dazzling. She was the perfect accessory, the beautiful, polished wife of a billionaire. "Darling, you've outdone yourself," she cooed, squeezing his arm. "Is everyone here?" "Of course they are," Julian said, his eyes scanning the crowd, calculating net worths. "It's the only entrance that matters." He was in his element, powerful, admired, and in control. The ghost of his first wife, the quiet, mousy woman whose name he hadn't spoken in 5 years, was a distant, faded memory. He had heard she'd moved to some dreary, insignificant place. He'd paid her a paltry sum as stipulated in their prenuptial agreement and had let his lawyers handle the divorce. It was a clean, efficient amputation of a part of his life that no longer served him. It was then that she walked in. He didn't notice her at first. His attention was captured by the collective ripple that ran through the room. The subtle turning of heads. The sudden pause in conversations. It was the kind of entrance that usually heralded the arrival of a movie star or foreign royalty. His eyes followed the crowd's gaze to the grand archway. The woman who stood there was not a movie star, he would have known her. This woman was different. She wore a simple floor-length silk dress in emerald green. It was a bold, striking color, but the cut was exquisitely discreet. It didn't cling or glitter, it flowed. Her hair was a sharp, dark bob that gleamed under the chandeliers, framing a face that was at once elegant and captivating. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, and eyes that seemed to possess a quiet, knowing power. A single, magnificent piece of jewelry, a handcrafted silver pendant that echoed the sculpture in the center of the room, rested at her collarbone. She was not conventionally beautiful like Celeste. She was something more compelling. She was art. "Who is that?" Celeste whispered, a rare note of insecurity in her voice. She felt a primal, feminine threat. This woman was not playing the same game she operated on a completely different plane. Julian grunted, his eyes narrowed. "I don't know. Probably some artist. The one who did the sculpture, I imagine." He dismissed her with the same casual arrogance he applied to anyone he deemed unimportant. She was staff, essentially. The woman began to move through the room. She didn't work the crowd or seek anyone out. She simply walked, her posture perfect, her gaze forward, a small, serene smile on her lips. People parted for her, their eyes following her. She was heading towards the sculpture. Her path would take her directly past Julian and Celeste. As she drew closer, Julian got a better look at her face. There was something, a flash of something familiar in the curve of her smile, in the shape of her eyes. It was like hearing a half-forgotten melody, a ghost of a memory he couldn't place. He dismissed it. A trick of the light. She was only a few feet away now. The event photographer, sensing the moment, raised his camera. The gala chair, his beautiful wife, and the mysterious artist. A perfect shot. Celeste, always mindful of appearances, put on a brilliant smile. Julian adopted a look of magnanimous patronage. This woman, after all, was contributing to his event. The artist, Eleanor Miller, paused as she reached them. Her cool, impersonal gaze swept over Celeste's glittering dress, then Julian's perfectly tailored tuxedo. For a fraction of a second, her eyes met Julian's. And in that moment, he felt nothing. No recognition, no spark of memory. He was looking at a complete stranger. A mildly interesting stranger, but ultimately irrelevant. "A wonderful piece," Julian said, his voice booming with false sincerity. He gestured vaguely at the sculpture. "A real conversation starter. Well done." It was the kind of praise one gives a caterer for a well-arranged canopy. The woman's smile didn't waver. It was polite, distant, and completely unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Foster," she said. Her voice was low and soft, with a timbre that was somehow both honeyed and unbreakable. "I'm so glad you find it to your liking." Then she directed her gaze to Celeste. "Mrs. Foster," she said with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "That is a lovely necklace," Celeste preened, touching the diamonds at her throat. "Thank you. Julian has impeccable taste." The artist's smile widened slightly, a subtle shift at the corner of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "He certainly does," she agreed softly. And then she was gone. She simply continued her serene walk to her sculpture, leaving Julian and Celeste standing in her wake. The moment had passed. The photographer, disappointed, lowered his camera. Julian turned back to the crowd, already dismissing the brief interaction. But the ghost of a melody was still there, nagging at the edge of his consciousness. Miller. Eleanor Miller. The name was common enough. And the voice. He certainly does. There was an echo to it, a phantom resonance he couldn't place. Celeste was prattling on beside him about someone's terrible shoe choice, but Julian wasn't listening. He was watching the artist. She was being greeted by the director of the city's Museum of Modern Art, a man who had snubbed Julian at a fundraiser last month. They were shaking hands, the director's face alight with genuine admiration. "Eleanor. The name rang out again, this time more loudly. Eleanor. The Children's Hospital fundraiser. I'm helping to organize it. The quiet woman on the cream-colored sofa. The simple bun. The beige cardigans. The wife he had erased. His blood ran cold. He looked again at the artist, who was now laughing at something the museum director had said. Her entire face was transformed by the laughter, vibrant and alive. He tried to superimpose the image of his mousy, timid first wife over this radiant, confident woman. It was impossible. They were two different people. And yet. He saw it. A tiny, almost invisible scar just above her left eyebrow, from a childhood fall she had once told him about. The way she tilted her head when she was listening intently. The specific, unique shade of dark chocolate in her eyes, now sparkling with life under the chandeliers. The whiskey he'd had earlier churned in his stomach. The air in the opulent ballroom suddenly felt thick, suffocating. He turned to Celeste, his face ashen. "What's wrong, darling?" she asked, her smile faltering at his expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Julian's gaze was fixed on the woman across the room. The artist. The stranger. The woman he had completely ignored. The woman he had praised like a servant. The woman who was impossibly, undeniably, his first wife. "I think I have," he whispered, the full weight of his colossal mistake beginning to crash down upon him. It was too late. The encounter had happened. The dismissal was complete. And the woman he hadn't recognized was now the most observed person in the room. What did you feel at this moment? Surprise, satisfaction, or maybe a little pity for Julian? The recognition didn't hit Julian like a lightning bolt. It was more like the slow, sickening creep of a tide of ice-cold water. One moment he was Julian Foster, master of the universe, standing at the pinnacle of his own glittering event. The next, he was a man staring into an abyss of his own creation. "That's not possible," he breathed, more to himself than to Celeste. "What's not possible?" Celeste demanded, her voice shrill with irritation. His sudden pallor was ruining the mood. "Julian, what is wrong with you?" He couldn't answer. His mind was a frantic jumble of disconnected images, the quiet, submissive woman leaving his apartment with a small suitcase, and the radiant, self-possessed artist presiding over her magnificent sculpture. The two realities refused to merge. How could the drab, colorless caterpillar he had discarded have transformed into this butterfly? And not just any butterfly, but one with wings of steel. He watched as the city's mayor, a man he'd been trying to get a meeting with for months, walked over to Eleanor, shaking her hand with genuine enthusiasm. The chairman of the board of the city's largest bank joined the conversation, laughing at something she said. She was no longer on the fringes of this world, she was its center of gravity. "I need a drink," Julian muttered, shoving a bewildered Celeste aside and heading for the bar. He ordered a neat whiskey and downed it in one fiery gulp. The alcohol did nothing to calm his nerves, it only sharpened the edges of his panic. He had dismissed her. He had looked the woman who shared his bed for a decade in the eye and treated her with condescension. A wonderful piece. Well done. The memory of his own pompous, patronizing words made his stomach churn. Not only had he not recognized her, he had insulted her on the biggest possible stage, in front of everyone who mattered. Meanwhile, Celeste's finely tuned social radar was blaring. She had seen the look on Julian's face. This wasn't about a bad business deal or a market fluctuation. This was personal. Her eyes darted to the artist, Eleanor Miller. Who was she? The name was vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. Celeste's world was designed to exclude anyone or anything that didn't directly benefit her, and a mousy first wife was definitely not on the list. She intercepted one of the younger members of the gala committee, a young woman named Sophie. The artist, Celeste said, feigning casual interest, Eleanor Miller. What's her story? Sophie's eyes lit up. Oh, she's amazing. A total genius. Came out of nowhere a few years ago. Her gallery, Miller Studios, is one of the hottest in the country. They say she turned down a commission from a sheik in Dubai to do this piece for us. Can you believe it? We're so lucky to have her. Sophie leaned in conspiratorially. And between us, Mr. Foster got her for a steal. Her usual fee for a piece this size is almost double what the committee approved. Celeste's painted-on smile felt fragile enough to crack. This woman was not only a smash hit, she was a bargain that Julian had stumbled upon. The idea was infuriating. She thanked Sophie and slunk back to Julian's side at the bar. So, the artist is apparently a big deal, she said, trying to sound nonchalant. How strange. I don't recall you ever mentioning her. Julian's knuckles were white as he gripped his empty glass. Her name. I didn't register it. The committee handled it. The committee? Celeste's voice was laced with disbelief. Julian, you approve every budget line item. You knew exactly who you were hiring. She stopped, a terrible suspicion dawning. She remembered fragments of conversations from years ago. Julian complaining about his divorce. A name. A quiet, artistic woman. Eleanor. Her blood ran cold. Oh my God, she whispered, her eyes wide with horror as she looked from Julian's ashen face to the woman across the room. That's her. That's your first wife. The question hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. It wasn't just that Julian hadn't recognized his ex-wife. It was that the woman he had replaced her with, the woman who had helped him discard her, had been so spectacularly outshone. Celeste, in her glittering, expensive gown, suddenly felt cheap. Her beauty was bought and paid for, a curated accessory. Eleanor's radiance was earned, a light that shone from within. The fallout began almost immediately, though subtly at first. The story of the brief, dismissive encounter began to circulate. It was too delicious to ignore. Julian Foster, the man who prided himself on knowing everyone and everything, had slighted the headliner of his own party. The first whispers were about his arrogance. But then, someone connected the dots. An older board member with a long memory remembered the first Mrs. Foster, that quiet girl who used to attend these things on Julian's arm. The story mutated, becoming infinitely more scandalous. Not only had he slighted the artist, he had slighted his own ex-wife, the woman he had cast aside. And he hadn't even recognized her. The atmosphere in the room changed. The looks directed at Julian were no longer just admiring. They were speculative, tinged with a delicious dose of schadenfreude. People looked from Julian and Celeste with their tense, frozen smiles, to Eleanor, who seemed completely oblivious, calmly discussing her work with a circle of admirers. The contrast was devastating. He was the past, loud and brutish. She was the future, elegant and serene. Julian felt the shift in power like a change in atmospheric pressure. He tried to recover, to work the room, but his confidence was gone. His jokes fell flat. His handshake felt less like a power move and more like a desperate plea. He saw people whispering behind his back as he approached. He had become a caricature, a laughingstock at his own party. For Celeste, it was a waking nightmare. Her entire identity was based on being Mrs. Julian Foster, the glamorous, envied woman who had won. But tonight, she was a cosmic loser. She saw the pitying glances of the other women, the smug smiles. They all thought the same thing: he left his wife for you, and his wife came back as a queen. Her diamond necklace suddenly felt like a heavy, vulgar chain. The final, crushing blow came during the live auction. The last item was a private commission from the artist herself, Eleanor Miller. When the auctioneer announced the lot, a wave of excited murmurs ran through the crowd. Bidding was fierce, quickly climbing into six figures. Julian, in a desperate, misguided attempt to regain control, to prove something he wasn't even sure what, entered the bidding. $200,000. His voice boomed a little too loudly. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to him, then to Eleanor, who was standing near the stage. She registered his bid with no flicker of expression. Was it surprise? Amusement? It was impossible to tell. Her face was a mask of polite neutrality. Another bidder immediately responded. 225. 250. Julian countered, his face flushed. Celeste grabbed his arm. "Julian, stop," she hissed. "What are you doing?" He shook her off. This was more than a painting. This was about reclaiming his narrative. He would own a piece of her success. He would force her to deal with him. The price climbed. 300. 350. Julian was bidding against a rival tech billionaire, a man he despised. It became a testosterone-fueled war of egos that played out in front of the city's elite. $500,000. Julian yelled, his voice slightly cracking. The room gasped. The auctioneer looked at Eleanor. She made a small, almost imperceptible head gesture. She then stepped forward and took the microphone. "Thank you all for your incredible generosity," her calm voice resonated through the silent ballroom. "And thank you, Mr. Foster, for your enthusiastic bidding." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "However, I must respectfully withdraw this item from the auction." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Eleanor held up a hand for silence. "Miller Studios has a policy," she continued, her gaze sweeping coolly over the stunned audience before settling for a brief, devastating moment on Julian. "We do not take private commissions solicited through a public spectacle. My art is not a trophy to be won in a bidding war." She smiled, a serene, unbreakable smile. "Instead, I will donate a new original piece directly to the Children's Hospital." "Thank you." She handed the microphone back to the bewildered auctioneer. And with one last elegant nod to the crowd, she turned and walked off the stage. She did not look back at Julian. She didn't have to. The humiliation was absolute. Not only had she rejected his money, she had rejected his entire world, its values, its power games. She had exposed his desperate bid for what it was, a pathetic, vulgar display. In one quiet, elegant move, she had utterly checkmated him. The fallout was no longer just whispers and gossip. It was a mushroom cloud, and Julian and Celeste were at ground zero. What did you think of this unexpected twist? Was this the best way for Eleanor to show her power? The days following the Starlight Gala were a masterclass in social and professional implosion for Julian and Celeste Foster. The story of the encounter became the city's favorite gossip, retold with increasing embellishment at every charity luncheon and country club dinner. It had all the elements of a perfect scandal: arrogance, beauty, revenge, and a fall from grace. Julian was no longer just the man who didn't recognize his ex-wife. He was the fool who tried to buy her at a public auction and was annihilated with delicate but firm precision. The narrative had been taken from him, and he was now merely a character in Eleanor Miller's epic. His phone, usually an incessant source of validation, went eerily silent. The first concrete sign of the turning tides came 3 days after the gala. Julian was trying to close a major real estate deal, a partnership with a contemporary named Mark Collins. The final call should have been a formality. Instead, Mark was evasive. "The board's pulling back, Julian," Mark said, his voice stripped of its usual camaraderie. "Pulling back. Mark, the numbers are solid. This is a guaranteed win." There was a pause. "It's not about the numbers anymore. It's about optics." The gala was all anyone talked about at the club this weekend. "My partners feel your personal brand is a bit volatile right now." "My personal brand?" Julian scoffed, the words tasting like venom. "What does that have to do with a real estate firm?" "It has everything to do with it," Mark said, his tone now sharp and final. "We're out." "I'm sorry." The line went dead. Julian stared at his phone, a vein throbbing in his temple. He had been dismissed, weighed, measured, and found wanting. Soon after, the board members of his own charitable foundation called an emergency meeting to discuss reputational damage. His power, which he had always believed was forged in his own brilliance, was revealed as a fragile construct held up by the perception of others. And that perception had been shattered. For Celeste, the reckoning was more personal, and perhaps more cruel. Her world was built on social currency, and her stock had plummeted to zero. She forced herself to attend a luncheon for the ballet, determined to face the whispers. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. She was seated not at the head table, but at a marginal one near the kitchens. The women who had once fawned over her now offered tight, pitying smiles. Then Genevieve Astor, a woman whose social position Celeste had always envied and sought to usurp, glided over to her table. "Celeste, dear," Genevieve cooed, her eyes gleaming with malice. "I saw the photos from the gala. Such a dramatic night. And your husband's first wife. What a talent." She paused, her smile widening. "Just goes to show, you never know who has hidden depths." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. Celeste was no longer the winner, she was the consolation prize, a footnote in the incredible story of Eleanor's rise. Her magnificent penthouse, once a symbol of her success, became a gilded cage. The silence that had once been Eleanor's torment now belonged to them. They circled each other in the vast, sterile rooms, the air thick with unspoken accusations. One night, Julian slammed a copy of a lifestyle magazine onto the marble kitchen counter. The cover story was a 10-page spread on Eleanor Miller titled, "The Art World's Phoenix." It was filled with stunning photos of her work, her gallery, and Eleanor herself looking serene and powerful. "Look at this," he growled, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "They call her a phoenix. What does that make me? The fire?" Celeste, who had been nursing a glass of wine, looked up with dead eyes. "It makes you the fool who let a phoenix fly so you could keep a parrot." The insult, so direct and vicious, hung between them. A parrot? Julian bellowed. I gave you everything. You were a glorified event planner before you met me. And you were married to a masterpiece you were too blind to see, she shrieked, her voice cracking. You didn't just ruin yourself, Julian. You ruined me. Celeste blamed Julian for his astounding arrogance. Julian, in the dark and twisted logic of a narcissist, blamed Celeste for not being enough, for somehow allowing Eleanor to eclipse her so completely. 2 weeks after the gala, Julian finally broke. Driven by a desperate, toxic cocktail of wounded pride, simmering anger, and a strange, uncharacteristic longing, he did the one thing his lawyers would have screamed at him not to do. He went to Eleanor's gallery. Miller Studios was nothing like the stuffy, intimidating galleries of his world. It was a bright, airy space with polished concrete floors and high ceilings, flooded with natural light. The art on the walls was vibrant and alive. And in the back of the gallery, in a glass-walled office, sat Eleanor. She wasn't painting. She was on a video call with a man on a large screen, and even from a distance, Julian could see the reverence in the man's expression. Eleanor laughed, a full, genuine laugh that echoed faintly in the gallery. Looking relaxed, powerful, and completely in control. She saw him approach through the glass. Her smile didn't waver. She calmly held up a finger, gesturing for him to wait. She finished her point with the man on the screen and said, "Talk soon, Tom." She clicked the screen off. Then she looked at him, her expression placid, as if he were a mildly interesting stranger who had wandered in off the street. "Julian," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a simple statement of fact. Her voice was even, betraying no emotion whatsoever. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He stood awkwardly in the doorway of her office, the power dynamic of their entire marriage reversed. Here, he was the supplicant. She was the one in charge. "Eleanor, we need to talk," he began, his voice hoarse. "Do we?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "I feel like we said everything we needed to say 10 years ago, and then again 5 years ago. And then, I suppose, again 2 weeks ago at the gala." The casual, cutting precision of her words stung him. "That night. I didn't. You recognize me," she finished for him, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "I know. It was quite obvious. In a way, I should thank you. It was the most honest moment our relationship has had in over a decade." The lack of anger in her voice was more unnerving than any diatribe. He had come prepared for a fight, for tears, for a dramatic confrontation. He was not prepared for this serene, untouchable calm. "I don't understand how this happened," he said, gesturing vaguely at the gallery, at her, at the whole impossible situation. "The woman I knew was quiet. She was simple. She would never have been able to do all this." For the first time, a flash of something not anger, but a deep, felt sadness crossed Eleanor's face. "The woman you knew," she said softly, "was a person you never bothered to see. You saw a reflection of what you wanted, a quiet, convenient accessory. You didn't see the artist, the dreamer, the person with her own hopes and passions. You didn't water the plant, Julian. And then you were surprised when it didn't bloom in your shadow." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling street. "You didn't break me, you know. You just erased me. And in doing so, you gave me the most incredible gift. You gave me a blank canvas. I got to paint myself back into existence, with my own colors, in my own way. Julian's desperation mounted. This was not going as he had planned. "I want to fix this," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I miss you." Eleanor turned from the window and laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, it was a sound of genuine, unadulterated disbelief. "Oh, Julian," she said, shaking her head. "No. You don't miss me. You don't even know me. You miss the idea of me. You miss the comfort, the silence, the woman who made your life easy so you could chase your ambitions and your affairs without interruption. And now, you miss what I have. You see my success, the admiration of others, and you want to own it, just like you tried to own my art at the auction. You haven't changed at all." It was at that precise moment that the front door of the gallery opened and Celeste walked in. She looked terrible. Her expensive clothes hung on her like a stranger's, and her face was a mask of tense anxiety. She saw Julian and her face hardened. "I knew it," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "I knew you'd come crawling back here." Eleanor looked from Julian's stunned face to Celeste's furious one. She sighed, the sigh of a woman dealing with tedious, predictable drama. "This," Eleanor said, gesturing between the two of them, "has absolutely nothing to do with me. Not anymore." She walked to her desk, picked up her handbag, and slung it over her shoulder. "I have a lunch meeting at the Modern with the Tate curator. He was the one on the call." She let that detail sink in, a final, effortless confirmation of the world she now inhabited. "Ben can help you both if you're interested in buying a piece." She paused, looking directly at Celeste. Her gaze was not cruel, but piercingly clear. "And for what it's worth, he's your problem now. You built your home on stolen ground. You can't be surprised if you have an unstable foundation." She walked past them, out of her office, and towards the front of the gallery. She stopped at the door and looked back at the two of them, standing frozen amidst the beautiful art born of her pain. They looked small and ugly in the bright, clean space. "Goodbye, Julian," she said, and the finality in her voice was absolute. It was the closing of a book, the flicking off of a light, the final silent fall of a curtain. Then she turned and walked out into the sunlight, leaving them behind in the beautiful, echoing gallery, forever trapped in the glow of a woman they had failed to see until it was far, far too late. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. Julian and Celeste were left with the echoing silence of the gallery, ghosts haunting a beautiful tomb they had unwittingly commissioned. They had their money, their penthouse, and their misery. Eleanor had herself. And finally, truly, that was everything. Her art continued to flourish, her name synonymous not with vengeance, but with resilience. She found love again, not in a whirlwind of power, but in the quiet, steady hands of a fellow artist who saw the colors of her soul from the very first day. Her greatest masterpiece wasn't a sculpture of rust and glass, it was the life she had reclaimed, a life painted in bold, brilliant strokes of her own choosing. She was the phoenix, and her world was finally, beautifully, on fire with her own light. And there you have it. A story of how the deepest betrayals can forge the most incredible strength. Eleanor's journey wasn't just a physical transformation, it was about the reclamation of her soul. She shows us that your worth is never determined by another person's inability to see it. What did you think of her epic comeback? Who was the real villain in this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of real-life drama and powerful transformations, Be sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching.